The aerodynamic development war in Formula One never comes to an end, and it's quite wonderful for that. After two high-speed, low-drag, low-downforce circuits at Spa and Monza, we're back to a sense of normality. Even though it's a brand new circuit at Mugello for Formula One as a racetrack, it's a little bit similar to a few other circuits we go to, so we see the return of a few old favourites. Ferrari, though, for their 1000th Grand Prix, or 997th if you ask me, but 1000th Grand Prix, they've come along with a new variation of the rear wings we've seen before, and the reintroduction of the double-decked T-wing. It's all to do with getting the best downforce for this type of circuit with lots of high-speed corners. Their cars rarely drop below fourth gear, and you'll see that up and down the grid with McLaren doing very similar. We've seen these wings before, but it's just interesting to see the comparison. Williams looking like they've gone for a very high downforce setup, which is quite surprising, but perhaps what they need to get that traction out of the many corners around Mugello. Haas is back with its double-dipped top section of its rear wings, quite a steep angle, and they've added the gurney flap on the top, which we've seen coming and going, whereas Renault's rear wing angle seems a little bit lower downforce car overall perhaps. We've seen it get some high top speeds at both Spa and Monza, and maybe they're following that philosophy. Red Bull, same story here, a rear wing, we've seen the same sort of concept, just a bit more angle for Mugello. It is after all a high downforce circuit, but also quite a few high speed corners. Who's got it best? We'll find out on Sunday. Experimentation is a key part of every race weekend for every single team, and McLaren are no different in that respect, turning up in free practice at Mugello with a brand new nose package. Now, the team didn't really plan to race it, but you can clearly see the difference. McLaren clearly experimenting with more Mercedes-style nose structure, and you've got that much tighter front wing support. Now, because of the homologation regulations inside that nose, it should be identical to the old version of the nose, and you can see the team have been whacking a lot of flow-vis on it to see how it interacts with the rest of the front end of the car. But following that Mercedes philosophy for a nose is a bit of a step for McLaren. They're not sure if it's working yet, and we won't see it used in the race, but it may appear later in the season or even into next season in 2021, where much of the car carries over. Not so much experimenting, but bringing a new part that will raise some eyebrows in the pit lane is AlphaTauri. On the back of that great result in Monza, where they used roughly that front wing end plate for Pierre Gasly, Danny Kvyat brought along this new modified version of the front wing end plate. And what's really interesting for me on it is this little feature on the rear section of we call it the foot of the end plate, and it looks to me very much like it has a hole in it. Well, that's a really important detail. They're trying to channel the air through to the inside and get a bit of inwash going on, I think. But in the Formula One technical regulations, you're specifically not allowed to have any vents, ducts or holes in the front wing end plate. So quite how AlphaTauri have managed to do this, I'm not sure. But it's fascinating to see them giving it a try, and so far, nobody's complained about it. There's been a lot of talk about copying in Formula One this year, and it goes on it's part of the sport, frankly. Everybody does it, and sometimes you see design trends. Well, one trend started by Haas a few years ago was putting Venetian blinds on the side of their car, not to try and get stop light coming in the living room, but to just try and get the aerodynamic performance around the base of the side pods working well. Well, Renault had previously run this style of side pod with a little sticky forward winglet, but turned up with one of the cars, Daniel Ricciardo, turned up with these Venetian blinds fitted to the car, and you can see those little cascade of winglets along the side. What that does, it just breaks up the airflow and the vortices coming off that really complex area around the bargeboard and just channels it correctly around the side of the car and under the floor. Really crucial part of aerodynamic development. Clearly with Renault trying both versions, they're not sure which one's better. I suspect they will end up racing with the Venetian blind version, but they have to be careful in traffic because it's very easy to damage them, and that really costs you a lot of aerodynamic performance. Sometimes aerodynamic development in Formula One is very iterative, and there's a great example on the rear of the Mercedes. They brought along a new T-wing to the Tuscan Grand Prix. This is the version they had earlier in the season at the Hungarian Grand Prix, little triangular section with a T-wing on top. Here, they've just made it slightly more curvy, slightly more dimpled, a little more sculpted. And I think that's just to play around. They've been playing around in the wind tunnel, found a little bit of benefit in terms of the vortices coming off it, a little bit of benefit in terms of the effect off that T-wing. Not going to make a massive difference to the rear end performance of the car, but those little tiny steps, every one of these marginal gains makes a big difference. But not all of the little differences you see on the car are that little at all. Now, one team that has brought a very big little difference to Mugello is Racing Point. They've turned up with a very significant upgrade on their car, and one that's interesting for more than one reason. The first thing that people probably noticed was the new side pods on the car, which are pretty distinctive. And Sergio Perez was running with one version before he had an unfortunate crash, and Lance Stroll, who's obviously staying with the team next year, got the new stuff. Interesting dynamic there, giving the driver who's leaving the old package, the driver who's staying, the new package. Not the first or last time we'll see it in Formula 1. But have a look here. You can really see the difference on the side pods. This is Lance Stroll's car. Look how much tighter it is around the side of the car. It's really shrink wrapped to the bodywork. And what they're trying to do there is optimise the airflow to around the rear suspension and to the rear wing in particular, and trying to get the most downforce out of it. And if this looks a little bit familiar to you, as it does to me, this little ramp on the side pod around the BWT logo, that looks really like a car from about 2012 in Formula 1, where you had those blown diffusers and those exhausts that would stick out just around that bit of the back of the side pod. That's not what Racing Point are trying to do here, but probably they understood some of the aerodynamic effects coming from that. The reason it might look a little bit familiar, because that's very much what Mercedes are doing with their 2020 car. It's a very similar concept. They obviously haven't copied it. It's not exactly the same, but it's extraordinarily similar. And as you see the car drive through the shot here, you can really see that sculpting and how much tighter it is around the bodywork of the car. Now, I'm not sure they have enough parts to run both cars in this configuration in the Grand Prix. We'll see on Saturday and Sunday, but that's a really big difference, and you can see a little bit of flow vis on the rear wing as they're evaluating the effect of that. So coming into the Tuscan Grand Prix weekend, one of the big news stories was, well, it wasn't that big a news story in the end, was that all of the protests relating to Racing Point's brake ducts had been cleared away in expectation that the FIA are going to announce a set of new rules for 2021 which really limit or define what degree of copying is allowed on a car. Well, in the words of Britney Spears, oops, they did it again. Racing Point arrived at the Tuscan Grand Prix in Mugello with the car fitted with what can only be described as 2020 Mercedes front brake ducts fitted. I'm really interested to see what the other team's going to think of this, because you can see how similar these two designs are. Now, they're not exactly the same. You can have a look, you can see the shape of, and I had to check there, that the Racing Point version, you can see the shape of the outside edge of the air scoop, that T section at the top with the little fences in there, and then this little U section here, and then the scalloping down there. Looking at the Mercedes version, you see all of the same shapes. You see that same T-section, that same grating there, that U-shaped section with the little drop down in the middle, and those same little scallopings in the brake duct there. But when I was looking at this in detail, I think, and I'm not sure, this angle makes it really difficult to see the difference, that this angle here is ever so slightly different by a few degrees, and this angle at the bottom is, again, ever so slightly different. Perhaps the result of developing something from a photograph rather than a model or a part you bought from the team. But my word, they are similar, and I think it's going to start all of the same arguments about, well, is the internal ducting the same? Is it a copy? Did they get design data from Mercedes? How are they allowed to get away with this? Are the other teams going to be happy with Racing Point going to this extreme in copying after everybody thought that matter was all left to conclusion? It's going to be a very, very interesting few weeks.